Hello, and welcome to the third episode of City Skyrim, the City Skylines series that unapologetically rips off Do Not Eat's Franklin series. We're at the dawn of the 20th century. In the past few decades, the Empire of Morrowind had been in relative turmoil. The last 50 years had seen conflict with other nations and consolidation of wealth and power by the upper classes. Meanwhile, economic downturn meant that the empire had to sell off its colonial ventures on the continent of Atmora, which at this point had become habitable, which meant that Morrowind was one of the few Tamrielic powers that lacked overseas colonies. General economic downturn, with the upper classes hoarding wealth, meant that the life for the average person, wherever they might have lived, was not good, to put it lightly. Those who were young and educated saw this and began forming revolutionary cells, many different revolutionary cells. There was this hot new political ideology from Kvatch called communism that spoke of liberation of the working classes from the bosses, landlords, and the monarchs. This also called for collective ownership of the means of production, as written in an excruciatingly long economics report by Karl Marx called Capital. But what is communism, I hear you ask? Is it when the state does things? Is it when we collectivize the toothbrush? Is it taking away your freedom to die punching in numbers to a spreadsheet while drinking your fifth cup of coffee at a cubicle farm like the God-fearing European you are? Is it fearing the long arm of the KGB while you're drinking victory gin in your concrete panel apartment building while wearing a government-issued jumpsuit? Well, no, not really. To understand communism, you have to ask yourself a few things. Is your boss asking more and more of you without you getting anything in return? Do you feel like you're not making an honest day's pay? In fact, does it seem like you haven't gotten a raise in basically ever, have to pay up half your wages in rent money, barely affording any luxuries? Does your boss tell you that the company doesn't make enough profit to raise wages while he just bought a brand new Mercedes? Does the government tell you that it can't spare any money on healthcare, public transit, education, or other basic services while spreading billions on the military and bailing out big corporations? Do you feel ripped off, alienated? That's because you are. Liberal democracy might tell us that the people hold the supreme power in the state, and well, on some levels that's true. You get to pick your representative in parliament. However, think about everyday democracy. When was the last time you had a say in how the workplace is run? And are you really free when your survival and access to basic services depends only on whether you generate profit? You are at any place and time closer to homelessness than you are to becoming reasonably wealthy. The aim of communism is to democratize the workplace by giving control to those who work there. It aims to give a decent shelter to everyone. It aims to create a social safety net that when you should lose your job or ability to work, you won't die. But I hear you ask, doesn't that mean that then nobody would want to work? No. Think about how many people already work without a profit incentive. I'm doing it right now. Humans like to be useful. We like to do things. By having basic necessities covered, we no longer have to associate work with survival, and with that remove the factor of alienation. Now, this is going more into anarchism territory as theorized by the Russian anarchist Pyotr Kropotkin in The Conquest of Bread, but getting into that is going to make this video way longer than it has to be. Anyway, as leftist ideologists do, communism splintered into many slightly different ideologies, and that reflected in the many revolutionary groups of Morrowind. You had the nihilists, the anarchists, the Frostfallists, the Morrowind People's Front, the Morrowind Socialist Radicals, the People's Front of Morrowind, the Morrowind Popular People's Front, the Socialist Revolutionaries, and various other socialists ranging from radicals to social democrats. Not all of them existed at the same time, but they all fall into the time frame of the late 19th century. Some of these groups resorted to terrorism, carrying out assassination attempts. It was in 6th era 1881 when Tsar Alexander II was assassinated via a nihilist plot, which saw a small package containing a bomb being thrown under the Tsar's carriage. The initial blast only damaged the blast-proof carriage, but as the Tsar got out, a second bomb was thrown at his feet. The succeeding Tsar, Alexander III, was a staunch reactionary who rolled back many liberal reforms of his predecessor. He believed that Morrowind could be saved from turmoil only by shutting itself off from the subversive influences of Western Tamriel. During his reign, Morrowind fell deeper into autocracy. Concepts like democracy, freedom of speech, and the free press were shunned. Anyone who was as much as suspected of being a revolutionary was heavily persecuted, often either being sentenced to penal transportation or death. Of course, oppression only creates more revolutionary sentiment, and in the first years of the 20th century, tensions were high. In 1894, Alexander III died, and his son, Nelith II, rose to power. Nelith II continued his father's oppressive policies, and was generally considered an inept ruler who had little interest in the business. However, thanks to new crops and improved railways, the economy slowly started to grow. This was the time when the Industrial Revolution in Morrowind properly began, as the Empire had remained overwhelmingly rural out of the interest of the local landlords who relied on agriculture for their wealth. Despite everything, Nelith II's popularity remained low. Now, as any autocrat knows, in order to gain popularity, you have to start and win a war. In 1905, Nelith saw easy pickings in the Akaviri, who were seen as inferior to the people of Tamriel. A land invasion supported by the Imperial Navy was launched, but despite the initial success, the Akaviri held fast. The Morrowindian troops did manage to advance in some areas, and the local population suffered heavily under occupation. Morrowindian soldiers committed a string of heinous war crimes. Every local was suspected of collusion and seen as the enemy. Such was their brutality that merely not speaking the common language of Tamriel was often a reason for summary execution. Local Akaviri were especially scared of the Orcish cavalry units, who had a deep desire to loot and killed everyone who stood in their way. The Akaviri were considerably less brutal, but looting was common even among the Akaviri, and suspected spies and collaborators were rounded up and beheaded in every town and village they retook. The overall invasion turned out to be a disaster. The Akaviri were considerably more capable than initially thought, leaving Morrowind humiliated. This was exacerbated by the disastrous voyage of their Ghost Sea fleet. While en route to Akavir, the fleet spotted a group of irritating fishing trawlers that they somehow mistook for Akaviri torpedo boats. The Dunmer were already on edge, and immediately began firing on the boats. Soon pandemonium broke out, and confused crews of the Dunmer ships began firing on each other, thinking each other to be the enemy. Eventually, the ceasefire signal was given after it was realized that no Akavir were actually in the area. Thanks to the poor gunnery of Dunmer's sailors, only one fishing trawler was actually sunk. It's said that one of the ships fired over 500 shells without actually hitting anything. The fleet pressed on, got hopelessly off course, lost a large portion of its crew to desertion and diseases, and when they finally reached Akavir, it was promptly sunk in their first actual naval battle against the Akaviri. At home, the war grew increasingly unpopular. Already before the war began, conditions of workers and farmers were dismal, and protest demonstrations were held. A month before the war began, a demonstration of 100,000 people led by a popular priest marched towards the Tsar's palace. They requested to speak directly to the Tsar, who at the time wasn't in the city. The soldiers calmly and politely asked the crowd to disperse. Just kidding. They began firing upon the unarmed protesters, killing and injuring nearly 1,000, including women and children. In the aftermath, hundreds were dead and over 6,000 were arrested. This was the catalyst to start the First Morrowind Revolution, which swept across the empire. Factory workers and peasants organized strikes which grew into uprisings. Soldiers and sailors mutinied against their officers. In Whiterun and the surrounding rural areas, workers, peasants, and rebellious soldiers rose up against what they saw as oppressive institutions. In the city, the compound of the Companions, who acted as a security force for factory owners and the imperial government, was attacked. The ancient mead hall was set ablaze and their palace bombed. Barricades constructed from furniture and overturned streetcars filled the streets as battles between the revolutionaries and soldiers loyal to the Tsar were fought. In the countryside, peasant uprisings led to the burning of manors and mass killing of the ruling classes. For them, the revolution was a chance for revenge against several hundred years of brutal oppression by the landlords. Overall, 100 manors were burnt. In some cases, the landlord was forced to partake in the destruction. In other cases, the landlords were humiliated in other ways, like hitching them up to a wagon and riding them to the local tavern. Meanwhile, a successful mutiny in Fort Sungard saw all of the officers' corps shot, and platoons of mutinous soldiers roamed the countryside, assisting the peasant uprisings. To stop the revolution, in an attempt to save his own life, the Tsar offered reforms that would satisfy the revolutionaries. In 1906, a constitution was drafted, and for the first time, the empire had a parliament. All non-Dunmer ethnic groups inside the empire were granted cultural and political autonomy, and even restrictions on speech and the press were somewhat lifted. However, the Tsar didn't make good on all of his promises, and the end result didn't please neither the hardline conservatives nor the revolutionaries. Many of the arrested were later executed. Official accounts list around 2,500 people, but notably these lists exclude punitive actions conducted by special battalions who summarily executed anyone who might have been a rebel, and those lists only list civilians. Furthermore, thousands of political prisoners were incarcerated in Skyrim alone, making up 20% of the Empire's prison population. Among them was the head of Clan Greymane, who led a nationalist cell of the revolutionaries. While their contribution didn't amount to much, their prominence made them convenient patsies. He and other high-ranking members of the clan were disappeared into the prison system, their compound razed and converted into a market. In the place of the bombed-out and burned palace of the Companions, the imperial government decided to begin construction of a new fort that would house the local garrison, under the pretense of protecting the city and surrounding areas. In reality, the garrison was responsible for upholding a state of martial law that lasted until 1911, during the course of which subversive newspapers were shut down and any dissidents arrested. Despite this, the following years would be a relatively peaceful time in the empire, and the Tsar managed to strengthen his power for the time being. This period saw more industrialization for Whiterun, as even more factories emerged and worker slums around them. Less than a decade after the revolution, Nelloth II dragged the empire into yet another war. Going back a few decades, the areas known as Hammerfell and Iratilia were not united provinces, but rather a mess of petty princedoms. By the 1880s, however, the kingdoms of Hammerfell and Iratilia were unified once again, after a series of wars and diplomatic actions. By 1914, a mess of alliances dragged every nation in Tamriel into a great war. Skingrad invaded Valenwood after a wood elf killed an Iratilic prince in Elsweyr. Valenwood was supported by Morrowind, who was allied with Brittany. Skingrad in turn was allied with Hammerfell and Altmeris. Iratilia broke off its alliance with Hammerfell and joined on the side of the Entente. Everybody thought that the war would be over by Talosmas, and 3 Talosmases later the war wasn't going that good for Morrowind. Back in 1914, the war had started with great enthusiasm, as a brand new wave of nationalism engulfed the empire. But by early 1917, the people were fed up. Troops on the front lines were dying by the millions, the population was starving, and the economy collapsed. In February of 1917, a massive popular uprising forced the Tsar to abdicate. Power was transferred to a provisional government which consisted of many political parties of various degrees, ranging from reactionaries to socialists. However, the provisional government did little to improve the life of the workers and refused to capitulate from the war. The president of the provisional government was a model centrist, who tried to keep all sides of the nascent republic happy. This was, of course, impossible. Even though Kerensky, that is both the real world and our fictional Kerensky, had introduced vast reforms like abolishing the traditional officer class in favor of soldiers' committees and adopting a policy of no enemies to the left, he still failed to win the support of the Bolsheviks, who in July of 1917 violently rose up against what they saw as a bourgeois republic. This initial uprising was, however, suppressed, and many Bolshevik leaders were either jailed or escaped into exile. That same policy of no enemies to the left, however, allowed the Bolsheviks to slowly but surely take over the army, and as mentioned before, workers were discontent over the grave shortage of food and other supplies, and of course the ongoing war. Socialist parties began to organize the Second All-Morrowind Congress of Soviets of Workers and Soldiers Deputies Congress. By October, discontent with the provisional government led to another revolution and subsequent civil war. Bolshevik revolutionaries stormed the palace of the provisional government. A warning shot fired by one of the battleships controlled by the Bolsheviks disgusted most of the other socialists, who left the Congress that was being held at the same time, cementing Bolsheviks as the leading socialist party and allowing Morrowind to finally sign a peace treaty with Hammerfell. In later media, the storming of the Winter Palace was shown as a glorious battle between the Bolsheviks and those defending the palace. In reality, the palace was taken without much of a fight. Even the gate was left unlocked and the Bolsheviks simply walked in. A few months later, Nelov II and his family were executed by the Bolsheviks in a small village in the Ashlands. Amidst the confusion of the October Revolution, prominent leaders in Skyrim took it upon themselves to declare independence from Morrowind. 3 republics were declared: Nordland, Skytonia, and Greater Ridgelands. The ongoing war, however, meant that most of these territories were under Hammerfell's control until late 1918, when the Red Guards were finally defeated by the remaining Entente forces. However, all 3 of these new republics were forced to fight for their independence as a part of the ongoing civil war in Morrowind. It's often thought that the Civil War was fought between the Communist Reds and the Imperial Loyalist Whites. Fact of the matter is that this war had an immeasurable amount of factions involving, but not limited to, the Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, Loyalists, Separatists, armed peasants, foreign expeditions, local separatist socialists, anarchists, local separatist monarchists, and so on. In most cases, all of these factions fought against each other, which made fighting the Skyrim Independence Force against the Bolshevik forces surprisingly easy. Initially, the Loyalists were fighting along Skyrim's Republican forces, but in late 1919, the Bolsheviks managed to convince the Republicans to agree to a ceasefire, and in 1920 peace treaties were signed. Nordland, Skytonia, and the Reach were established as independent republics, with Nordland and Skytonia bordering the newly established Soviet Union. The borders of Tamriel were redrawn once again, believed to weaken Hammerfell to the point where the continent would surely reach a new era of peace, prosperity, and political stability. So, what did we learn from this episode? Wars do not solve economic and political problems. Sending young men and women to die in a far-off land while your own population suffers is only going to accelerate downfall from power. It should also be remembered that while the communist revolution in our own timelines Russia was betrayed by power-hungry apparatchiks, it was the only alternative to the ongoing oppression by the ruling classes. You cannot boil it down to simplistic rallying calls of peace, bread and land, but you have to consider the grave limitation of liberal reforms in a system where the lower classes own little to no political power. The right to choose between working 40 hours a week for subsistence wages and death is not freedom, but coercion. In our own day of age, we must reconsider centrist policies, as in reality these policies will only take us further right, down the path of fascism and a general capitalist dystopia. We can already see how neoliberal policies are taking away the rights of working classes and endangering public health under the guise of economic freedom. Well, economic freedom for whom? Economic freedom for corporations to pollute while you're left sipping cola through a thin paper straw while wondering how you're going to pay the heat bill next month? We must remember that the revolutions of 1905 and 1917 only happened because of the ruling class's inability to see the workers other than an expendable mass of labor. True freedom is when even the worst off members of society won't have to worry about the basic necessities like food, housing, healthcare, education, utilities, and so on. A capitalist system, however, has time and again demonstrated failure to provide that. Thank you for watching episode 3 of City Skyrim. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like so the algorithm shows it to more people. Also, please subscribe so you don't miss out on upcoming content. The next video will be a general urbanism video about parking and Jerry Seinfeld. Here's the cinematics.